Well, it's time for us to talk about the rib. I just kind of grimaced as I said that because last week, as luck would have it, I sneezed and nearly broke my rib. But anyways, that's not the rib we're talking about here. We're talking about the routing information base. Fancy language indeed for what you and I would commonly call our routing table. That's right, we're going to look in detail at the routing table and issues surrounding the routing table in this lesson number 2 of Module 1. We talked about this topic in the last lesson. You really need to know it for the written, for core knowledge. You would even want to know these numbers for the lab exam, although admittedly you could look them up in the configuration portion of the lab exam, but obviously that's not going to help you if you're in the core knowledge questions of your lab exam. So please, let's just... I dislike memorizing things as much as anyone, especially since I do tend to have short-term memory issues. But look, we want to memorize these values. That can be very helpful to us. And in order to do that, all you need to do is make some flashcards. That's what I would recommend. For a lot of these topics, you're going to want to make flashcards. Just go out, get some index cards, or you could even just cut up pieces of paper. On one side, you're going to write internal EIGRP. On the other side, you're going to write the number of 90, the administrative distance or the believability of internal EIGRP. Isn't it interesting that administrative distance has nothing whatsoever to do with distance in the traditional sense? And maybe that's why students do struggle to understand this concept. We're not talking true distance here. We're talking a measure of believability or trustworthiness with administrative distance. Notice things like IBGP aren't very trustworthy. We would not listen to IBGP compared to OSPF if both of those mechanisms were indicating how to get to a particular prefix. This is because IBGP could be prone to misinformation. It could literally much more likely get like a routing loop or a routing black hole situation when compared to the very trustworthy OSPF. Notice that eBGP, on the other hand, external BGP, has a great score, a super score. It's a low administrative distance of 20. So we do want to memorize these, and flashcards should be able to help us get that done. By the way, one last note on this. What's the deal with the unknown value, 255? Well, that's how we can poison a prefix or prefixes using administrative distance and make sure they do not make it to the routing table. And here we can see one of these routing information bases or RIBs, otherwise known as the routing table. And notice when I do a show IP route, we get a legend for the routing table. That's kind of nice. And then we get gateway of last resort information. Sounds like something out of a Stephen King novel. What we're talking about there is whether or not we have a default gateway set for this particular router. Where is it going to send traffic if it doesn't have a specific subnet entry in the routing table for that? And then we have the routing table entries themselves. Notice that we have a couple of OSPF learned routes in this sample routing table, as well as a directly connected route entry. What's really interesting is the OSPF route entries. Let's look at those. There's a subnet out there at 10.20.20.0. That's 10.20.20.0 with a 24-bit mask. And we can see the administrative distance is reported for OSPF here for us of 110. And then the OSPF metric, in this case a cost, an OSPF cost of 11. We'll look at OSPF cost in great detail later on in the course. And then we can see that we can get to that particular prefix via 10.10.10.10. So we're going to send traffic to the 10.10.10.10 device in order to route it to 10.20.20. Notice this has been in the forwarding this actually isn't the forwarding information base we're looking at. We'll talk about that momentarily. This is the routing information base. We can see it's been in there for 9 seconds, and we can see that we will use the Fast Ethernet 0/0 interface in order to send packets destined for that subnet to the 10-10-10-10 device. So here is a look at our routing table, and you want to be able to very quickly and succinctly break down what each component in that routing table entry means. These days, and you heard me slip up on the last slide, these days I always want to call the routing information base the forwarding information base, or FIB. What in the world is a forwarding information base? And you need to know this for the CCIE written exam. The forwarding information base, or FIB, is a copy of the routing table information, and this copy of information is stored right in the hardware memory of the Cisco device. You see, when we do table lookups in software, it's a relatively slow process with some overhead, but it's very, very fast and efficient when we do routing table lookups in memory. So the forwarding information base is a copy of the route table information, and it's placed right in memory. You saw how we did a show IP route to see the routing information base? Well, to see the forwarding information base, we'll do a show IP ceph. Now you might think, why isn't it show IP fib for forwarding information base? Well, Cisco Express Forwarding is this technology that we use in order to store this information in memory on the device. So the forwarding information base is a structure in memory to help us route. It's basically a copy of the routing table, and this is a key ingredient in Cisco Express Forwarding. The very, very advanced methodology for forwarding traffic as rapidly as possible through a Cisco device. You might ask, is there anything more in memory for this Cisco Express Forwarding to function? And yes, there is. There is basically a copy of the ARP cache information, also in memory, and this is called the adjacency table. So what you end up with is everything that the router needs to route right there in memory for the most efficient possible routing on these Cisco devices. Well, certainly congratulations are in order. You've just survived another lesson of the CCIE Route Switch written boot camp here at Internetwork Expert. Please join us in the third and final lesson of this first chapter, where we're going to look at redistribution in all of its glory, a very, very important topic for the written as well as the lab exam.